Recording in progress. A very good afternoon to you joining us here in Geneva for a press conference with the Commission of Inquiry on the Syrian Arab Republic. Joining me here is Paulo Pinheiro and Hanny Megally, members of the Commission of Inquiry. The third member, AbuZayd, unfortunately couldn't be with us here today. The commissioners are presenting their latest report, which is being presented to the Human Rights Council on the 23rd of September. That's next Thursday. The report is now available online. It was sent with some of you through embargo means this morning. It is online, and there's a press release you should have in your inbox at present. For those of you who have had trouble receiving it, please do let us know. We did have some problems in distributing it this morning, but I rest assured you should have it in your inbox at present, in English and Arabic press release, along with the report itself, again, to be presented to the Council on the 23rd. So without further ado, I hand over to you, Paulo, for opening remarks, and then to you for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roland. It's already pressed. Good afternoon. We are very glad to meet with you here in our 10th year of work of this commission. Of course, any reduction of violence vis-a-vis the civilian population.
Your mask.
Okay.
It's better without it.
Okay, thank you. I repeat, because now without the mask. Of course, any new development in the war in Syria, we have to acknowledge, and we are very happy that the level of airstrikes and bombardments in all the territory has diminished. But we arrive now here at this very month, and in the months that preceded the publication of our report today, that even if the conflict in terms of a war with weapons has diminished, we acknowledge that there are at least 3 regions in the northeast and the northwest and the south where we continue having some expression of the traditional way in a conflict. But what we are seeing today in Syria is a war against the civilian population. Many of the human rights violations and the crimes in terms of humanitarian law, they continue. Then we continue having these war crimes and crimes against humanity, and the infringing the basic human rights in Syria. As President Assad enters, he was re-elected, his 4th term in office, allegedly controlling 70% of the territory and 40% of the pre-war population, there seems to be no moves to unite the country or seek reconciliation, as a lot of people hope. On the contrary, we see incidents of arbitrary and incommunicado detention by government forces continuing unabated. The overall situation in Syria looks increasingly bleak. In addition to increasing violence, the economy is plummeting, and widespread community transmission of the COVID-19, we cannot forget that, seemed unstoppable by a healthcare system decimated by the war and lacking oxygen and vaccines. What makes us to say that perhaps there is no time for anyone to think that Syria is a country fit for its refugees to return. Recent months, as I said, have seen increased fighting and violence both in the northwest, northeast, and south of the country. According to the report that we are launching, covering the period of 1st July 2020 and 30 June 2021. The lull in hostilities that I have referred in the opening of these remarks in northwest Syria, brought about by the March 2020 ceasefire agreement between the Russian Federation and Turkey, unhappily began unraveling with increasing aerial bombardments and shelling. Meanwhile, the Southwest experienced fighting has not seen since before the 18 Russian brokered agreement between the Syrian government and the armed opposition groups. What is really pathetic in this 21st century, that the past months have seen the return of sieges and siege-like tactics in Dara, in Koneitra, and Rif Damascus governorates. When we were reporting about sieges, we have the hope that the years to come, the sieges will disappear, but that is not the case. Meanwhile, despite public statements indicating a desire to adhere to basic human rights norms, the terrorist organization Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, continue imposing restriction on media and the freedom of expression in its area of control in the Northwest. Because as in our past reports, we just cover what the government perpetrates, but since the first report, we are always offering to everybody who reads our reports what is happening in the side of the armed non-state armed organizations. The security situation in certain areas under the control of SDF also deteriorated, seeing increased attacks by Daesh remnants, conflict with Turkish forces, and mounting discontent and protests amongst the population, in particular in Arab-populated areas. But one of the most scandalous features of our report is what is happening with the estimated 40,000 children held in Al-Hol and other camps. Nearly half are Iraqi. 7,800 come from nearly 60 other countries. Since mid-2019, almost 5,000 Syrian children have been released from the camps to communities in Northeast under so-called tribal sponsoring agreement. Some 1,000 foreign children have also been released and brought home. Yet, most foreign children remain deprived of their liberty, since their home countries refuse to repatriate them. We have the impression the most ratified convention in the world, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, is completely forgotten, and democratic states that are supposed to abide to this convention, they neglect the obligations of this convention in what is happening in Al-Hol and other camps and prison places. Most are under 12 years old. No one accused them of crimes, yet for over 3 years, they have been held in horrifying conditions, deprived of their right to education, to play, to proper health care. And what is also lamentable is that we don't have consolidated numbers of the kids. And we are asking more transparency by states and by UN bodies and agencies to have numbers, correct numbers about these children in detention. And I conclude this saying that these children must be protected. I feel even embarrassed saying that. Also be protected in line with international human rights and humanitarian law, that all the 60 nationalities of this, the state of the 60 nationalities of these children, they are perfectly aware of these obligations. Protection can never mean indefinite detention of children. The first remedy for an unlawful detention is release. Punishing children for the sins of their parents cannot be justified. And somewhat embarrassed, I stop my introduction here. Thank you very much.
And thanks to you, Paulo, for those opening remarks. We will now turn to our colleagues for their questions. I see in the chat we have a question from Antonio Brotto of EFE. Elisa, if we can unmute Antonio. He's unable to raise his hand, but if you could find Antonio. EFE Antonio Brotto, it's under EFE.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my question. About the situation in Al-Hol, I would like to know if these children, the majority of the children, are unaccompanied, are without their parents, or the parents are also there? Do you have complete numbers of how many people are in this camp?
Hello. Antonio, thank you for the question. No, the vast majority of the children are there with their mothers. There's a small number in the hundreds that are unaccompanied, as far as I understand, and mostly they're held together in a sort of a separated area where they're being looked at in terms of trying to identify their nationalities, etc. But as Paulo says, 40,000 children altogether, as far as we can tell, 27,000 of them Iraqi, 7,800 come from 60 other countries than Iraq, and then the remainder are Syrian, about 13,000.
I'd like to add that sometimes some states' excuse is to not repatriate the children because they don't want to separate from their mothers, and they prefer to keep the children detained with this unacceptable excuse of not separating the kids from their mothers.
Maybe just to say, I mean, the challenge, what governments are saying who don't want to bring back their nationals is we won't take the children on their own, we'll leave them there with their mothers because we don't want to take the mothers. And then you get into a discussion about, they don't want to take the mothers back, either because they see the mothers as having voluntarily gone to join the Islamic State in Syria and therefore have committed crimes, or they may be radicalized and violent and they don't want to bring them back, in a sense, bringing back a virus with them to the home country, or they think that they can be put on trial where they are, but if they're brought home, they may not have enough evidence to be able to put them on trial for more serious crimes than going to join a terrorist organization or an enemy. And so that's the argument that's been put forward. But we're now 30 months, 2.5 years into this situation, and I think most people are now in agreement that the children should be home, and in fact, the mothers should be brought back with the children, and most countries ought to be able to have judicial systems to deal with the challenges of how they deal with the mothers that they bring home with the children.
As Hanny said, we are going through this surreal dialogue, surreal discussion for the last 30 months. It's not something that we are having this year. This is an ongoing surreal discussion that I think that is very important to call the attention of the international community. The international community is not delivering everything that is supposed for the benefit of those children.
Thank you both for your responses. Now we have a question now from Lisa Schlein of Voice of America. If we can unmute Lisa, please. Go ahead, Lisa.
Hi. Yeah, I got unmuted. It's great. Nice to see you all. Please indulge me a moment. Since this is virtual stuff, I have a couple of questions that I'll ask you instead of separating them because it'll get lost in the in the Zoomosphere. Okay, thank you. First, in your report, you talk about ongoing war crimes and crimes against humanity. Could you be specific about how many there have been since your last report, where and what and by whom? And if you could kind of bring us up to date about the situation in Aleppo, which has been very problematic for a long time. We haven't heard much about that, I must say. Is the fighting still very active there? Are there really close to 1 million people still displaced, living in horrid conditions and not getting the humanitarian aid they need? And perhaps this next question fits in with that, in that you also mentioned that you were appalled at areas still being under siege. Which areas? That's about it, except, yeah, one more about the kids. How young are they? And children have the nasty habit of growing up and becoming adults. And if countries are reluctant to bring them back now when they're young, shouldn't they be reluctant to leave them there? Because as they grow older in this appalling atmosphere, they themselves are likely to become radicalized and future terrorists perhaps, and pose a problem to their national countries. Thank you very much.
Okay, Lisa, thank you for those questions, all well noted. Who wants to start off? Okay, Hanny is got his finger on the button. Go ahead.
Voila, lots of questions, Lisa. And to be honest, your first one, you know, we could be spending the whole session discussing the ongoing war crimes and crimes against humanity. I mean, in the report, what we've shown is that the patterns remain that we've reported on in previous years, but what even more concerning is after the elections that Assad won, and after the Syrian state is, on the face of it, back in control over 70% of the country, instead of seeing the picture now begin to move towards, let's say, a more peaceful one or less violations, we're actually seeing an uptick in the violations and in the fighting and in the violence. Wherever you look, you know, if you look in the north, in the south, Daraa, there were protests and then there were clashes. And then you asked a question about sieges. We had the siege, for example, in Daraa al-Balad, 2 to 3 months, reminding us of what was happening in the past when we had sieges in other places in Syria. You know, it's only 2 or 3 months into it, but it's the same tactic of preventing food, medicine, and other goods coming in and preventing people from leaving. There have been negotiations which we hope will lift the siege. Again, the pattern of people being sent to the north that the Syrian state did not want to remain, handing over of weapons. And you fear, you know, the same pattern repeating itself. In terms of the crimes, you know, the aerial attacks and bombardments that are hitting civilian objects, schools, hospitals, marketplaces, etc., detentions, torture in detention, deaths in custody, sexual gender-based violence, you know, unfortunately, even cases of rape. The situation of the children, I should add, you're absolutely right. You know, children grow up to be adults, and so you want them to have a childhood that is not fraught with being held in awful conditions by the international community, so to speak, because they're not willing to take them back to their countries. But I wanted to add an element which we didn't mention in the beginning, which is, in addition to those in the camps, you have children, minors, you know, let's say between the ages and 12 and 18, who are in detention, in prisons with adults who are suspected of being affiliated with or fighters for the Islamic State. And there again, you have to ask the question, you know, what good does it do to put children with adults who may themselves be radicalized or may be violent or may have been fighting in the conflict? Wouldn't it be better to immediately remove them from that situation? And wouldn't it be better to be taking them home? Paula, I don't know if you wanted to come in.
Yes. Thank you. No, hi, Lisa. I'd like just to add beyond what the government forces do. I think that's very important also to, in the area that you are interested, that areas under government control continue to suffer attacks by armored groups. Armored groups members launched attacks on residential neighborhoods, damaging homes, a market and the local cemetery, killing at least 3 civilians, including 1 child, and injuring 16 others. In a pattern that we began to document in past reports, HTS continued to curtail freedom of expression, including media activities, as part of previous documented effort to stifle political dissent through arbitrary detention. And finally, I'd like to add that female media workers and activists have been doubly victimized. In one emblematic example in the report, a female activist was held incommunicado by HTS members for speaking up against the group for a period of at least 3 months. She was released in January 2021. The so-called Salvation government also imposed new rules, including a mandatory accreditation for journalists. I think this helps to have an encompassing view of the situation in Aleppo that you are interested. Thanks.
Thank you for those thoughtful responses. We have a question now from Robin of AFP. If we can unmute Robin. Go ahead, Robin.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Your report makes clear that the economy is plummeting and violence is increasing and the situation looks bleak. Are there any signs of hope that the situation could improve anytime soon, or does it look set to keep getting worse for the foreseeable future? Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. It is looking quite bleak. I mean, let me say some of the brighter signs are we're seeing with some of the groups in control of territory, like the SDF in the northeast or the Syrian interim government in the northwest. They're beginning to talk the language of we're opposed to human rights violations. We want to investigate violations. In our discussions and in our reporting, they have been telling us that they're investigating some of the findings in our reporting, that they're trying to put a stop to recruitment of children, for example, or to put a stop to ill treatment in detention, etc. And that's a positive sign. You know, sadly, we continue to receive reports of violations and you know, whether that's sort of elements that continue to violate and need to be brought under control, or they need to be more vigilant, I think becomes the discussion. But that's a good sign, although I don't want to give the impression that the human rights situation has improved dramatically. Sadly, it hasn't. But then what we're seeing is that there's an uptick in the violence. We talked about Dara in the south, in the northwest. We're seeing increasing aerial bombardments and shellings, and then counter shellings by the HTS and others in the Idlib area. Whether this is something that will lead to maybe more ground operations, etc., is always the fear, because the ceasefire from March last year has by and large held, but now we're seeing an increase in the fighting, and that's of concern. And of course, we're seeing in both areas, people are moving in anticipation of maybe worse to come. And then in the northeast, we're seeing also insecurity increasing. There were demonstrations against food prices and plummeting economy that turned violent, and perhaps excessive use of force in putting down the demonstrations led to a number of deaths. We're investigating that. We have seen a number now of improvised explosive devices going off, which are alarming because these are indiscriminate weapons, and people who get killed are not necessarily targeted. But we're also seeing targeted assassinations, people on motorbikes masked, riding up and assassinating targeted individuals, at least 10, I think, in the northeast from July last year to May this year. So that the level of violence is growing, and the anticipation that, more conflicts, we're seeing increasing clashes between the autonomous authorities and the Turkish-backed forces in the north. All of it is not a picture that Syria is moving into a phase of maybe negotiations or peace, but actually the reverse is what we're seeing. Thank you.
Thank you, Hanny. Now we'll turn to Jeremy in the room in the back from Radio France Internationale. Jeremy.
Thank you, Rolando. Two questions for you. Going back to the children issue, I was wondering, do you put the blame particularly on the Western countries, in the sense that as long as rich countries won't repatriate the children, others might say, okay, we're not doing it because the West is not doing it? And the second question is about your access to Syria. Have you completely abandoned the idea of ever going there? I mean, are you still legally, technically asking the government to have access to Syria, or have you ceased it? Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, we have not, during the last 10 years, we are, oh, sorry, what? Mask. Sorry. This choreography, I'm bad doing that. During these 10 years, we have not abandoned some creativity in terms of having access to Syria. Of course, we are very much tempted to go to the areas where we are seeing the northeast, the northwest, and the south. We are always very much tempted to visit, and we are exploring all the possibilities to do that. Something that an example of our creativity, if you see our report, the report has 46 pages. 21 pages are the letters we send to the Syrian government about all the incidents that are present in the report. Of course, we haven't received any answer, and in the interactive dialogue, the government will accuse us of taking sides and not contacting the Syrian authorities. I think that if you go through these letters, you see how the offers that we do to have access to information. Of course, if the government will respond to our letters, their narrative will be inside the report, of course. But perhaps they are not, they will never be convinced of that. The question to put the blame, we don't put the blame. We just see that those states that for the last decades have been done sort of giving lessons to the world, to the South, of the importance to abide to the Convention of the Rights of the Child. Myself, I coordinate a report on violence against children, and the Western democracies had a wonderful presence in showing the best practice. I don't think that's only the Western countries. All the states that are not able to repatriate the children, and they continue tolerating this abuse on the children, they are responsible. That is, if you go through our graph, the page of numbers, is something terribly difficult to do. Because first, the countries are not interested in having transparency about what their nationals are in those institutions. And second, also international organizations they are not in agreement to reach a consolidate numbers that we have. But I think it's our duty to do that. Who will speak in favor of those children? At least the Commission has to ask some transparency concerning this absurd situation. Thanks.
Thank you, Paulo. We'll take one more question from the room from Musa, from Al Mayadeen, and then we'll go back to our Zoom participants. Musa, go ahead. Allez-y.
Merci. J'ai deux petites questions en français. La première, je reviens à la question de mon collègue ici sur les enfants qui sont dans le camp Al-Hello, les enfants soi-disant de Daesh. Est-ce que vous avez envoyé des lettres au gouvernement concerné de ces enfants pour qu'ils évacuent leurs enfants de ce camp? Est-ce qu'ils...
Je peux répondre à une question, sinon j'oublie.
Allez-y.
Ce que j'aimerais dire, bien sûr, on est en contact avec tout le gouvernement qu'on mentionne. C'est-à-dire, on ne publie pas notre correspondance. Mais bien sûr, on est en contact, on fait de gestion pour que la cause de ces enfants soit considérée par ces gouvernements.
Est-ce qu'ils vous répondent? Est-ce que vous pouvez nous dire leur réponse? Merci.
Peut-être un jour, on publiera notre correspondance, mais pour le moment, on ne dit rien. On continue à faire de bons efforts pour qu'on arrive à convaincre. Et c'est-à-dire pour ne pas avoir une situation tout à fait négative, on a reçu de réactions positives qui ont reçu nos appels avec... mais il y a beaucoup plus de réactions positives à ces moments. Mais on a perdu 30 mois sur cette affaire.
Bon, je continue là-dessus. Selon vous, pourquoi ces pays ne reprennent pas leurs enfants?
Je crois qu'il faut voir dans chaque pays. Chaque pays a sa manière de... la terreur, la peur de ce que les enfants sont de terroristes éduqués par ces organisations-là. Il y a c'est-à-dire, je crois que le judiciaire est très ouvert à cette cause. Mais il y a aussi les sociétés qui, pour de bonnes raisons, craignent le terrorisme et ont une panique de voir ces enfants et leurs mères arriver. Et quelques pays ont des difficultés aussi à considérer comment organiser les jugements de de ces gens qui ont eu de liaison avec Daesh.
En anglais, s'il vous plaît. Just to add to what Paulo is saying, I mean, there are some good signs, as we were saying, 30 months later, that governments who were initially saying absolutely not are beginning to change their policies. And often that's also because within the countries, the people themselves are saying, how can this be happening to citizens, etc. Whereas maybe initially the thinking was, these are all terrorists, we don't want them back in our country, they can stay where they are, we're not going to help them. And essentially, again, the reasons that they're feared is partly by painting them all with one brush, saying they're all terrorists, they're all radicalized, they're all violent, and therefore we can't risk bringing them back because they may then spread that within our countries, where in fact, if people were to look more closely as they are and when they're looking at how people got recruited into joining the Islamic State or other violent extremist parties or terrorist groups, the reasons are varied, and they don't necessarily relate to being radicalized or being extremely violent, etc. And so the same ought to apply when you're looking at bringing people home, whether they are guilty of crimes or they really more need forms of rehabilitation and reintegration. But in all of that, of course, the children are completely innocent. And that's what's become the biggest problem now. And I think more and more states are recognizing that this can't continue. And it's actually worse to continue as we are than to think about bringing them home and tackling that issue, which they feared in the beginning.
And I'd like very much that my last sentence could be repeated as a mantra. Punishing children for the sins of their parents cannot at all be justified. This is unacceptable. And this is more serious when you have states that have fought for the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's, as you know, is the human rights instrument in the world with the highest number of ratifications. Only one country that I never will indicate has not ratified yet. Even Syria has ratified the convention. And for us, this is a scandal. We have been taught of the qualities of the convention, and then we try to remind the countries of these qualities.
Non, c'est une petite question. Concernant la situation économique, comme vous savez, la situation économique en Syrie s'est détériorée d'une façon tragique ces derniers mois. Malheureusement, je n'ai pas pu lire le rapport, on n'a pas reçu à temps. Mais est-ce que vous mentionnez cette crise? Quel effet ça fait sur les conditions de la vie des Syriens et de leurs droits? Merci.
It's what we've seen is rising prices and basics, including prices of bread. What we've seen are reports obviously coming from UN agencies who are tracking these things much more than we are able to. The Syrians who are food insecure, we've seen a 50% increase in 1 year, which is quite an amazing increase. 12.4 million Syrians, according to UNFPA, are food insecure. That's quite a dramatic number. Fuel shortages, again, that's causing great problems. And the hardships that the Syrians are facing, particularly in the areas where the Syrian state is back in control, are beginning to show in terms of protests by Syrians who have been loyal to the state and are now saying 10 years conflict, our lives are getting worse rather than are getting better. You know, when do we see an end to this? And the response often from the state has been quite harsh, or in some cases, I think we've seen quotes that if people are not happy, they should leave, which is not something that encourages us to be thinking then that this is a situation for refugees to be returning to their home country.
We'll go back online. Thank you for your patience. We have Laurent Sierro and then to Nick Cumming-Bruce. We'll start with Laurent from Swiss News Agency. Go ahead.
Thank you for taking my question. Syria has received doses of COVID vaccines through COVAX. Do you have any indication that there might have been an intentional deprivation of vaccine towards certain parts of the population by the government as a tool of war? And could that also be a problem in the northern part of the country, in other regions controlled which are not controlled by the government, and where some stakeholders might have access to doses through their allies? Thank you.
I'll just say something very brief. Of course, the problems that you are seeing in Syria is very similar in different worlds, in the different continents of the world. I don't think that, that is, I will not buy this very conspiratorial theory that the government create problems for the access to vaccines. Of course, we know that only 1% of the population had access to vaccines, but we have similar percentages in different countries in the world. I think that to be fair, I think that we have to take into account several aspects of several common aspects of the pandemics in every country in the world. But perhaps Hanny would like to say something.
Yeah, is this on?
No, I don't know why. Okay.
Voila, strength. A couple of things to say. I think in terms of vaccine availability, and particularly COVAX, the figures we've seen, and again, it's not an area we necessarily have been investigating thoroughly, but it's between 1% and 3%, would cover between 1% and 3% of the population, and it seems like, you know, really only 1% of the population may have been covered. Now, you have to remember, this is a country that's been in conflict for 10 years, where many of the hospitals and medical facilities have been partially destroyed or totally destroyed. And therefore, you would be saying, you know, this is a country that needs help in order to tackle a problem like this pandemic and the new variants, which are, you know, bringing down, you know, the strongest and the wealthiest of states back into lockdowns. And so you wonder how, you know, Syria will cope. Figures are very difficult to come by because, you know, you're relying on official figures, and in many countries, official figures don't necessarily paint the full picture. But the figures that we're seeing show that the numbers are higher in the Northeast and the Northwest, whether that's because the figures in the areas under the government control are not the correct figures, I couldn't tell you, but we are concerned that a year ago we weren't seeing figures going up as fast as they are now, which suggests Syria is now facing a more serious variant, and we may be seeing, I think, worse results from it. We have always been concerned, not just, I mentioned the medical facilities and the hospitals, but also when you have a country with a prison population that some say maybe, you know, up to 100,000, let's say in the tens of thousands, overcrowding, poor hygiene, and systematic torture. And so you have also detainees and poor health. This is not encouraging if there's a pandemic that's looming and could be hitting those vulnerable populations as well. And then on top of that, the displaced, the IDPs in different parts of the country, also living in poor conditions, also living in areas where hygiene is not up to the standard that we would hope to be able to contain the impact of the virus. So it's a picture that's raising concerns, but it's very difficult to get access to real figures on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you. We now have a question from Nick Cumming-Bruce of the New York Times. Okay.
You hear me?
Go ahead. Yeah, we hear you now, Nick. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry. I actually have 3 questions. In the areas where you are identifying the application of siege tactics, I'm wondering who these target. Are you seeing some reconstitution of the old military opposition groups? Are you seeing some new form of opposition groups? Are they just localized, random opponents, or is there some pattern of opposition to the government emerging in these areas? So that was one question. The second question is, your report talks a lot about pro-government forces. I wondered if you had a sense of the extent to which foreign militias, Iranian militias and others, are still present, whether there are more or less, or whether they are playing a bigger or lesser role in Syria these days than, say, a year or 2 ago. And my third and final question was, you reported more than 50 US airstrikes. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about these airstrikes, where they're occurring. Are they all in northeast Syria? Are they primarily targeting ISIS? Or is there some other military strategy being applied here? Thank you.
Thank you. On the siege tactics, and we're looking particularly closely at Dar al-Balad. It's sort of 3 months into this, and as we speak, our team is still sort of investigating the roots of where this came from and why. But essentially, it seems that with growing protests, etc., the groups within, and if you remember, this is a little bit where the whole protest movement began 10 years ago, had been accumulating weapons and were resisting the state coming in and maintaining a little bit the autonomy that they had managed to achieve after reconciliation had been agreed and between them and the state, and they had a bit more freedom of movement, etc., within their areas. And as the clashes then became more serious, then we saw the state really move in and encircle, begin to bombard and threaten with more, unless a number of the people in there were brought out and then sent up to the north, and heavier weapons were handed in. There were negotiations. The Russians, I think, played a role in getting some of the negotiations off the ground. Agreements were reached, and then they broke down again. It seems the requests for heavy weapons to be handed over were then followed up with requests for lighter weapons to be also handed over. It seems the numbers of people to be displaced to the north also grew. There were also efforts to get some people released, and those numbers again changed, etc. So as we speak, our team is sort of following it, but it's a similar pattern to what we've seen in the past, where the state, in essence, doesn't want to risk sending its soldiers in a situation where they may be encountering heavy resistance. So it's better to lay siege and try and starve out the population, and that was our concern there. I can't really give you numbers of armed, how many armed people were inside, etc. But clearly enough to stop the state from rushing in and dealing with it. When we talk about pro-government forces, often it's because it's not very clear to us as well who precisely is responsible for what action, because often they're close to each other and often coordinating with each other. But we do have, of course, various Syrian militias that are attached to the state. We also have a number of trained Syrian military security people where the Russians have been training them to a slightly higher level, who get involved. And of course, we still have Iranian forces on the ground. And then in the skies, we have primarily Russia and the Syrian Air Force. On the US airstrikes, these are figures published by the US, in terms of transparency and numbers, and then others, I think, have been verifying them. But I don't know if we could tell you now, which areas they primarily were hitting. But if I can get that information, we'll get it to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Hanny. Okay. We have a question from Bayram Altug from Anadolu News Agency from Turkey. Bayram.
Thank you, Rolando, for taking my question. Mr. Pinheiro, you underlined at the Commission report that Syria is not fit for safe and dignified returns for refugees. As you know, Turkey hosts the most refugees in the world, including 3.7 million Syrians. Perhaps Turkey pays the biggest price in Syrian war. So thus, especially this year, Turkey often expresses that it can no longer share the burden. So will the United Nations take on more responsibility sharing the burden of those refugees? Do you have, on the other hand, do you have any advice for third countries on this regard? Thank you so much.
Yes, it's a challenging question you ask, because we always think it's unfair that the countries that happen to be the neighbors of a country that's in conflict with the civilians fleeing are the ones that then end up receiving the displaced civilians and who then become refugees. And Turkey, of course, has borne the brunt of that. As we also always say, two wrongs don't make a right. And while the country remains in conflict, it would be difficult to be saying that those who fled should now go back. We were hoping that, with the Syrian state back in control of most of the country and with a sort of a ceasefire in the northwest, that we would see with a lull return to some stability or some form of safety that might make people start to think a peace process may be in the making and people might be able to return. But as you can see in our report, we look at different parts of the country and we see the levels of violence and fighting are going up rather than down. And then we look at the whole country and we see the economy plummeting. We see food shortages and, as we said earlier, 12.4 million insecure. We see fuel shortages. We see the pandemic hitting and the numbers rising. And that's what makes us say at this moment, Syria really is not a country that could be taking people in. They're struggling at the moment to tackle all of these issues. The solution obviously has to be a political one where the parties sit down and negotiate. And we know the UN Special Envoy has been working very hard to get some agreement. But the picture is looking bleak right now, I have to say.
Thank you, Hanny. We have time for one last question, again from Lisa Schlein of Voice of America.
Yeah, hi. Just a couple of quick follow-up questions. Hanny, on the situation of refugees you were talking about, are people actually returning to Syria? And if so, how many or has that situation actually dried up? I mean, because you're issuing these warnings, I wonder whether they're really necessary. And then on the bombardments, I think you indicated that that the Syrian Air Force with its Russian allies are bombing areas. Is that right? How extensive are these bombardments, and in which part of the country? Thank you.
Okay. On the refugees, there are some returns, but the numbers are really very, very small. And I don't have the latest one. Maybe the team, if they have it, can give it to you. But really, the numbers are very small. And given, people will often, when they flee a country, especially their home, if they see an opportunity, they will try to rush back. I think that in itself tells us that people are not looking to return quickly. In terms of the bombardments, we're seeing more now in the sort of Idlib region, Russian and Syrian planes and shelling, which, as I said earlier, for us means the ceasefire is starting to fall apart. I'm not saying it's completely fallen apart, but it's a worrying sign that that there may be then efforts to move forward and regain more territory or negotiate control over more areas or whatever. But certainly we are seeing an increase in bombardments and of course the return shelling from the areas where the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is in control into areas that the Syrian state controls. And again, these are indiscriminate in both areas. It's civilians who bear the brunt of military tactics.
Perhaps the last word that I'd like to say about Syria is that, of course, as I said in my opening remarks, is undeniable that was a reduction in terms of the formal war hostilities, a reduction of hostilities. But the government in place is the same as during the last 9 years. And the policies that the state, the Syrian state and the Syrian government implements is the same as before. Perhaps some of us, we had a false hope that the reduction of formal hostilities, bombardments, will inspire the government to change its activities against the Syrian people. Then this expression of a Syrian war against the Syrian people, because we continue to see not only the sieges, but we continue to see the detention, the torture, the missing, and also the acts of the government are complemented by the activities, as Hanny just mentioned, by UN declared terrorist organizations and non-state armed groups. I think this is very important also to have a full picture of the situation, not only what the government and the government allies are doing, but also what is being perpetrated by terrorist groups defined by the UN and non-stated armed groups. The situation continues. And of course, we don't want to pass a certificate that no place in the country is safe. because we don't know. Nobody knows, not only us. But what we are able to report, we conclude that is not a situation fit for the return of the refugees. I think this would like to be our last consideration. Thank you very much for your patience with us during the last 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Hanny and Paulo, very much for your time with us today, and for you out there reporting, and for joining us. Again, the Commission of Inquiry will present this report to the Human Rights Council next Thursday, the 23rd of September. I remind you that the report, English and Arabic versions, are available online, and wish you a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.